The world does not break all at once. It breaks slowly. It begins with noise. A constant stream of headlines announcing crisis after crisis. Markets fluctuate. Governments argue. Social media erupts in outrage before breakfast. Every day feels like a new emergency. Every notification feels urgent. Every opinion demands a reaction. You wake up already behind. There is pressure to succeed in an economy that feels unstable. Pressure to perform in a culture that never stops watching. Pressure to curate your image, to defend your beliefs, to respond instantly to messages and accusations and expectations. If you fall short, the consequences feel immediate and public. Rejection stings harder in a world where comparison is constant. Someone else is always achieving more, earning more, gaining attention faster. Betrayal spreads quickly when conversations are archived and shared. Failure lingers online, preserved in memory, searchable and permanent. And beneath all of this, a quiet fear begins to grow. What if I can't keep up? Many collapse under this weight. Anxiety becomes a permanent state. Anger simmers just below the surface. Small inconveniences feel catastrophic. Criticism feels like annihilation. The mind becomes reactive, volatile, exhausted. But then there are others. They experience the same chaos, the same instability, the same uncertainty. Yet they move differently. They do not rush to react. They do not crumble under insult. They do not panic when plans collapse. They remain steady when everything around them trembles. Why? Why do some people break under pressure while others remain unmoved? The answer is not luck. It is not superior intelligence. It is not emotional numbness. And it is not invincibility. To be undefeatable does not mean you never lose. It does not mean you avoid pain, criticism, or hardship. It means something far more unsettling to those who seek control over you. It means you cannot be psychologically conquered. The world can take your job. It can take your reputation. It can take your comfort, your possessions, even your freedom. But if it cannot dictate your inner state, if it cannot command your judgment, then something essential remains untouched. This idea is ancient, long before modern self-help books promised productivity and confidence. There were thinkers who lived in eras far more unstable than our own. They did not write from comfort. They wrote from chaos. One was born into slavery, his leg permanently injured by a cruel master. Another served under a paranoid emperor who could order his execution at any moment. One ruled an empire during plague and relentless war, carrying the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. Others faced exile, political persecution, public humiliation. They did not retreat into fantasy. They did not preach optimism detached from reality. Instead, they developed a psychological framework designed specifically for uncertainty. Their philosophy did not promise comfort. It promised resilience. It did not teach control over events. It taught control over interpretation. It did not eliminate suffering. It redefined it. This philosophy would later be called Stoicism, but Stoicism is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for emotional suppression, for passive acceptance, for indifference. In truth, it is something far more radical. It is the assertion of inner sovereignty in a world that constantly attempts to dominate the mind. It asks a dangerous question. What if the only true defeat is internal? In a world obsessed with controlling outcomes, controlling narratives, controlling people, Stoicism shifts attention to the only domain that cannot be forcibly taken: your judgments, your choices, your response don't in a world obsessed with control. Stoicism teaches control of the only thing that cannot be taken, your mind. To understand Stoicism, you have to leave behind the illusion that it was born in calm times. It did not emerge from luxury. It did not arise in eras of stability. It was not crafted in quiet libraries by men untouched by hardship. Stoicism was forged in collapse. The story often begins with a shipwreck. Zeno of Citium was a merchant before he was a philosopher. On a voyage across the Mediterranean, his ship was caught in a storm and destroyed. Cargo lost, wealth gone. The future he had imagined for himself erased in a single event. He arrived in Athens not as a successful trader, but as a man stripped of status and security. There, according to tradition, he wandered into a bookstore and began reading about Socrates. Something shifted. Instead of rebuilding his former life, Zeno began questioning the very assumptions that made its loss so devastating. If fortune can vanish overnight, perhaps it was never truly yours. If external circumstances determine your peace, then your peace is permanently fragile. Stoicism began with a man who lost everything and refused to lose himself. But this was not an isolated moment. Ancient Greece was a world of shifting alliances, political intrigue, and fragile city-states. Security was never guaranteed. Power changed hands quickly. Public reputation could elevate you or destroy you in a matter of days. And as Stoicism evolved, it moved into Rome's civilization, both magnificent and unstable. The Roman Empire was vast, wealthy, and powerful. Yet beneath the grandeur lay paranoia, corruption, and constant threat. Emperors were assassinated. Senators were exiled. Accusations could mean death. Stoicism did not develop during Rome's triumph. It developed during its anxiety. Epictetus, one of its most influential teachers, was not born into privilege. He was enslaved. His master, according to accounts, was cruel. At one point, his leg was twisted so violently that it was permanently damaged. Epictetus knew what it meant to lack freedom in the most literal sense. And yet, from this position of powerlessness, he articulated one of the most radical ideas in philosophy. You may chain my body, but you cannot chain my will. For him, Stoicism was not abstract theory. It was survival. Seneca, another Stoic, lived at the center of political instability. He served as advisor to Emperor Nero, ruler known for vanity, cruelty, and unpredictability. Seneca navigated a court where favor could turn into execution. Eventually, he was accused of conspiracy and ordered to take his own life. He faced death not as a philosopher safe in speculation, but as a man directly confronting it. Then there was Marcus Aurelius, often remembered as the philosopher king. He ruled during a time of plague that decimated populations and during relentless military conflict along the empire's borders. His personal writings, later known as meditations, were not composed for public admiration. They were private reminders to himself. In them, he wrestled with frustration, exhaustion, betrayal, and mortality. These were not calm eras. These were times of disease, war, instability, and political fear. And yet, from these conditions emerged a philosophy centered not on controlling events, but on mastering response. This is what distinguishes Stoicism from much of modern self-help culture. Today, advice often focuses on optimization. Be more productive, earn more, achieve more, present yourself better. The implicit assumption is that you can engineer your environment into stability. Stoicism assumes the opposite. It assumes instability. It assumes loss. It assumes that power structures will shift, that reputation will fluctuate, that health will decline, that death will come. It begins not with ideal circumstances, but with worst-case scenarios. Stoicism is not comfort philosophy. It is crisis philosophy, and that raises a deeper question. What did these thinkers understand about the human mind that allowed them to remain steady in eras that would shatter most people today? At the center of Stoicism lies a principle so simple it almost feels disappointing. It does not promise mystical insight. It does not rely on complex metaphysics. It begins with a division. There are things within your control, and there are things outside of it. This is the dichotomy of control. It sounds obvious, almost trivial, but when examined honestly, it becomes unsettling. External events are not within your control. The economy can collapse. A storm can destroy your home. A company can fire you. A disease can spread across continents. No amount of anxiety can alter these facts. Other people's opinions are not within your control. You can act with integrity and still be misunderstood. You can speak carefully and still be You can offer kindness and still be rejected. Reputation is not fully yours. It exists in the minds of others, shaped by perception, rumor, and bias. Wealth can disappear. Status can evaporate. Power can be stripped away. Even your body is not permanently obedient. It ages, it weakens, it fails, and death stands beyond negotiation. If you pause long enough, you realize that much of what dominates your emotional life belongs in this uncontrollable category. Yet there is another domain: your judgments, your reactions, your decisions, your character. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can influence how you interpret what happens. You cannot dictate whether someone insults you, but you can decide whether their words penetrate your sense of self. You cannot guarantee success, but you can choose the effort you bring to your actions. This is where Stoicism draws its line. Most psychological suffering emerges when these two categories are confused. Anxiety often arises from attempts to control the uncontrollable. You replay future scenarios in your mind, trying to pre-solve problems that may never occur. You worry about how others will judge you. You obsess over outcomes that depend on forces beyond your reach. The mind searches for certainty in a world that does not provide it. Anger consumes because it attaches moral outrage to events that cannot be reversed. Someone disrespects you. A plan collapses. Injustice occurs. You replay the moment, wishing it had unfolded differently. But the past is not negotiable. The only thing left is your reaction. Resentment lingers when you believe peace depends on someone else's apology. You wait for validation. You wait for fairness. You wait for the world to align with your expectations. In doing so, you outsource your emotional stability to circumstances that may never change. Stoicism suggests that suffering is often not produced by events themselves, but by the interpretations we assign to them. An insult is sound waves until you label it humiliation. A failure is data until you label it identity. A rejection is one person's preference until you interpret it as proof of inadequacy. This does not mean events are meaningless. It means their emotional weight is filtered through judgment. In modern life, the triggers are constant. Social media outrage spreads faster than reflection. A stranger's comment can provoke hours of emotional turbulence. An algorithm surfaces opinions designed to provoke reaction. You are pulled into arguments about events you cannot influence. You feel compelled to respond, to defend, to react. Your peace becomes entangled with strangers' perceptions. Career instability adds another layer. Promotions depend on market forces, corporate politics, shifting priorities. You may work diligently and still be overlooked. If your sense of worth depends entirely on outcomes, you live in a permanent state of fragility. Relationships expose the same dynamic. You can act with sincerity and still be rejected. You can invest emotionally and still be left. If your stability depends on another person's choice to stay, then your inner world is perpetually at risk. The Stoic insight is not that these things do not matter. It is that attaching your peace to them guarantees volatility. This is where the tension sharpens. If you cannot control outcomes, why are you attaching your identity to them? If you cannot control other people's judgments, why are you surrendering your self-worth to their opinions? If you cannot prevent loss, why are you building your stability on what can be taken? The mind becomes undefeated not by eliminating chaos, but by relocating control. Instead of demanding certainty from the world, it demands discipline from itself. Instead of seeking validation, it seeks integrity. Instead of clinging to reputation, it focuses on character. This shift is subtle, but revolutionary, because once you internalize it, the world loses leverage. Events still occur. Criticism still happens. Failure still visits. But they no longer dictate your internal state without your consent. And that realization begins to erode fear. If your peace depends only on what you can govern, your judgments, your actions, your character, then chaos loses its authority. The world remains unpredictable, but you are no longer. If the dichotomy of control exposes where our power truly lies, the next obstacle becomes painfully clear. It is not the economy. It is not politics. It is not even chaos itself. It is the ego. The ego is subtle. It rarely announces itself as weakness. It disguises itself as dignity, ambition, self-respect, identity. It whispers that you must be seen a certain way, that you must be acknowledged, that you must not be diminished. And yet, beneath its confident posture, the ego is fragile. It needs validation to feel real. It feeds on approval the way fire feeds on oxygen. A compliment can elevate your mood for hours. A single criticism can unravel it just as quickly. This volatility is not strength. It is dependency. The ego fears disrespect more than failure. Many people can tolerate losing money, losing opportunities, even losing relationships. But being publicly embarrassed, being perceived as incompetent, being laughed at, that cuts deeper. Why? Because ego equates perception with identity. If others see you as weak, you begin to fear that you are weak. If others doubt your intelligence, you begin to question it yourself. The external gaze becomes the mirror through which you measure your worth. This is why the fear of looking weak drives so much behavior. People remain silent when they should speak. They posture when they feel insecure. They exaggerate achievements. They hide uncertainty. They avoid apologizing because apology feels like surrender. In reality, it is ego defending an image. Status becomes another addiction. Titles, followers, wealth, influences become symbolic armor. They signal importance. They create hierarchy. They protect against invisibility. But the higher the status, the greater the anxiety of losing it. Digital culture has amplified this fragility to unprecedented levels. Your persona is no longer confined to physical spaces. It exists online, curated and measured. Likes, shares, comments, quantified validation. Approval becomes numerical. Comparison psychology intensifies the effect. You scroll through filtered success stories, curated achievements, staged happiness. Subconsciously, you measure your life against performances. You begin to feel behind, inferior, overlooked, and the ego reacts. It demands improvement, not from a place of growth, but from a place of competition. It wants to outshine, to prove, to correct perceived disrespect. Even outrage online often masks wounded pride. An opposing opinion is not just disagreement. It feels like a personal attack on identity. Reputation, anxiety follows closely behind. You begin managing perception rather than cultivating character. You ask not, is this true? But how will this look? You edit yourself for approval. You soften your convictions, or you exaggerate them to appeal to a tribe. The irony is brutal. In trying to protect the ego, you become controlled by it. Stoicism approaches this differently. It introduces humility, not humiliation, but clarity. You are not your status. Titles can be removed. Wealth can evaporate. Followers can If your identity is fused with these, you dissolve when they disappear. You are not your praise. Compliments reflect another person's perception, not your essence. If praise defines you, criticism will destroy you, and you are not your criticism. Being judged does not automatically redefine your character. Someone else's opinion is information, not destiny. This humility is not weakness. It is psychological independence. The Stoics understood that ego amplifies suffering because it personalizes everything. Traffic becomes disrespect. Disagreement becomes hostility. Neutral events become threats to identity. Imagine two people insulted in the same way. One laughs and moves on. The other replays the words for days, constructing arguments in their head, imagining confrontations, feeling humiliated. The event is identical. The suffering is not. The difference lies in attachment. Ego says, "How dare they speak to me like that?" Humility asks, "Why does this disturb me?" Most people are not defeated by events. They are defeated by wounded pride. Wars have begun because leaders could not tolerate perceived humiliation. Careers have collapsed because someone refused to admit error. Relationships end not from incompatibility, but from the inability to apologize. Pride resists correction. It resists vulnerability. It resists growth. And yet, when ego loosens its grip, something unexpected happens. Insults lose their sting. Comparison loses its urgency. Status becomes practical rather than existential. If someone calls you unintelligent, it only wounds you if you believe your intelligence requires universal validation. If someone mocks your ambition, it only destabilizes you if your ambition depends on their approval. Ego hands power to everyone. Every passerby becomes a potential threat. Every critic becomes a judge. Stoic humility reclaims that power. It says, "Your character is measured by your actions, not by applause." Your integrity does not fluctuate with trending opinions. This does not mean indifference to growth. It means detachment from vanity. You can pursue excellence without worshipping image. You can accept criticism without collapsing. You can hold status without being owned by it. and here the tension reaches its peak. If nothing can insult you without your permission, then who truly has power over you? If humiliation requires your internal agreement, then the battlefield shifts inward. The world can attempt to provoke, to label, to mock, to exclude. But if the ego does not rise to defend illusion, there is nothing to attack. The most unshakable individuals are not those with the highest status. They are those whose identity is not for sale. So the real question is not how to eliminate criticism, or how to secure universal respect. The real question is whether you are willing to loosen your attachment to the image you are trying so desperately to protect. Because once the ego stops demanding constant defense, a different kind of strength emerges, quiet, stable, untouchable. There is a persistent misunderstanding that has followed Stoicism for centuries. People imagine a cold face, a rigid posture, a human being untouched by grief, unmoved by beauty, immune to joy. They imagine emotional suppression, a life drained of color in exchange for control. But that image is not strength. It is numbness. Stoicism was never about becoming emotionless. It was about becoming un-are-you-led. To understand this distinction, you have to look at how Stoics viewed emotion itself. They did not treat emotions as random storms imposed by fate. They saw them as consequences of judgment. An event happens. The mind interprets it. The interpretation generates the emotion. Between stimulus and feeling lies belief. Anger, for example, is rarely just anger. It is wounded expectation. You believed someone should behave in a certain way. They violated that belief. The mind labels it injustice. The body reacts with heat, tension, urgency. But consider this carefully. Expect strangers to act perfectly. You will live in constant irritation. If you expect betrayal from no one, you will be shocked by reality. The intensity of anger is directly tied to the rigidity of your expectations. Fear operates through a similar mechanism. It is imagined future pain. The mind constructs scenarios, failure, humiliation, loss, rejection, and reacts to them as if they are already unfolding. Your heart races not because something is happening, but because you believe something might happen. The body does not always distinguish between imagination and reality, and so fear becomes rehearsal for events that may never occur. Envy emerges from comparison, distortion. You see someone else's success and interpret it as evidence of your inadequacy. Their achievement becomes your deficiency. You assume life is a zero-sum game. If they are ahead, you must be behind. But notice what all these emotions share. They are built on interpretation. The Stoics argued that events themselves are neutral. A job offer is neutral. Losing a job is neutral. Praise is neutral. Criticism is neutral. These are facts, raw data. It is your interpretation that assigns meaning. This idea aligns remarkably with modern cognitive psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most evidence-based approaches to emotional regulation, operates on a nearly identical principle. It teaches that distorted thinking patterns, catastrophizing, personalization, overgeneralization generate emotional suffering. Change the thought, and you change the emotion. If you lose your job and interpret it as I am worthless, despair follows. If you interpret it as this is painful, but not a definition of my value, the emotional outcome shifts. The event has not changed. The judgment has. Emotional discipline, then, is not suppression. It is examination. It asks, What belief is fueling this feeling? Is it accurate? Is it helpful? Is it within my control? When anger rises, discipline asks, what expectation was violated? Was that expectation realistic? Can I control the other person's behavior? When fear appears, discipline asks, is this threat real right now? Or am I reacting to a projection? When envy surfaces, discipline asks, am I measuring my worth against external markers that fluctuate? This is not denial, it is clarity. Suppression buries emotion without questioning it. Discipline dissects emotion to understand it. And through this process, something profound happens. You begin to experience feelings without being consumed by them. You can acknowledge anger without acting destructively. You can feel fear without surrendering to paralysis. You can notice envy without allowing it to erode gratitude. This creates stability under chaos. Imagine two individuals facing public criticism. One immediately internalizes it, spirals into defensiveness, and lashes out. The other pauses. They analyze the critique. They separate useful feedback from projection. They respond deliberately or not at all. Externally, the situation is identical. Internally, the architecture is different. The disciplined mind does not eliminate emotion. It shortens its lifespan. It reduces its distortion. It prevents escalation in chaotic environments, political instability, social outrage, economic uncertainty. This discipline becomes a form of power. Systems often manipulate emotion to control behavior. Fear drives compliance. Anger drives division. Envy drives consumption. If your emotions are easily triggered, you are easily steered. But if you understand how interpretation shapes feeling, you become harder to manipulate. You pause before reacting. You question the narrative presented to you. You examine whether your outrage is authentic or engineered. This is the psychological mechanism of becoming undefeated, not invulnerable, not detached from humanity, but resistant to manipulation by internal distortions. Emotional discipline transforms reaction into response. It creates a gap, a small but critical space between event and action. In that space lies freedom. Without it, you are predictable, provocable, controllable. With it, chaos still exists. Loss still occurs. Injustice still appears. But your inner state is not automatically hijacked. You remain deliberate, and this is where Stoicism reveals its deeper ambition. It does not promise comfort. It promises sovereignty. When your emotions are understood rather than suppressed, examined rather than obeyed, you stop being a prisoner of every passing thought. You become stable not because the world is stable, but because your interpretations are disciplined. And in a world that constantly seeks to provoke, distract, and destabilize, that discipline is not just philosophical, it is revolutionary. There is a dangerous illusion at the heart of modern life. We believe comfort equals progress. The temperature is controlled. Food is delivered instantly. Entertainment streams endlessly. Discomfort is treated like a malfunction rather than a feature of existence. We have engineered a world where inconvenience feels offensive. But the Stoics warned of something subtle: comfort, when unexamined, breeds fragility. They practiced voluntary discomfort not because they romanticized suffering, but because they understood psychology. If you only function under ideal conditions, you are owned by those conditions. So they trained. Some exposed themselves to cold intentionally. Not recklessly, but deliberately. They would step into icy water or walk in winter air without complaint. The goal was not punishment, it was rehearsal. To teach the body and mind, this sensation is unpleasant, but survivable. Others practiced fasting, skipping meals, not out of scarcity, but by choice. Hunger became a reminder that desire does not equal emergency. You can want and not immediately satisfy that want. You can feel discomfort without collapsing into it. They wore simple clothing, slept on hard surfaces, lived periodically with less than they could afford. Seneca, a wealthy Roman, would spend days living as if he were per-eating basic food. Wearing coarse garments, ask himself, is this what I feared? Most often, the answer was no. Then there was negative visualization. Instead of obsessing over best-case scenarios, they contemplated loss, the death of loved ones, the loss of status, illness, exile, not to become morbid, but to reduce shock, to understand impermanence before it arrived. This practice strengthened gratitude and prepared the mind for reality. Contrast this with modern hyper-comfort society. Instant gratification trains impatience. If a video buffers for 3 seconds, frustration arises. If a message is not answered immediately, anxiety grows. Digital dopamine rewards constant stimulation, scrolling, clicking, consuming. We avoid boredom. We avoid silence. We avoid hunger, cold, rejection, uncertainty. But avoidance does not eliminate discomfort. It amplifies sensitivity to it. If you have never experienced voluntary hunger, an unexpected missed meal feels catastrophic. If you have never faced rejection intentionally, a single no can destabilize your confidence. If you have never tolerated silence, solitude becomes unbearable. Comfort narrows your tolerance, and systems understand this. A population addicted to comfort is easier to manage. Offer convenience, and resistance softens. Provide entertainment, and attention fragments. Deliver endless stimulation, and reflection diminishes. Voluntary discomfort disrupts this cycle. When you choose hardship, you reclaim agency. Cold showers teach you that discomfort does not dictate action. Fasting teaches you that desire is not command. Simplicity teaches you that identity does not require excess. Negative visualization teaches you that loss, while painful, is survivable. If you practice hardship intentionally, life cannot shock you as easily. Imagine losing status after periodically living without it. Imagine facing financial strain after practicing simplicity. Imagine enduring criticism after rehearsing humility. The sting remains, but it does not paralyze. Fragile comfort says, I can only function when conditions are favorable. Trained resilience says, I can function regardless of conditions. This is not about self-punishment. It is about expanding capacity. The mind adapts to what it experiences. If it only experiences ease, it becomes intolerant of strain. If it occasionally experiences strain voluntarily, it becomes confident under pressure. Voluntary discomfort also exposes illusions. Many fears dissolve under direct contact. The cold you dreaded becomes manageable. The hunger you feared becomes temporary. The simplicity you avoided becomes freeing. You begin to question how much of your anxiety was built on imagination. There is power in choosing difficulty before it chooses. You, athletes, train under resistance, so competition feels lighter. Soldiers rehearse chaos, so battle feels familiar. Philosophers practiced austerity, so fortune could not intimidate them. in a culture that equates happiness with comfort. This philosophy feels counterintuitive, but history suggests something different. Civilizations decline not only from external threats, but from internal softness. Individually, the same pattern appears. When life inevitably introduces hardship, betrayal, financial loss, those untrained in discomfort often experience shock layered on top of pain. This should not be happening intensifies suffering. The Stoic response is quieter. I knew this was possible, and that knowledge stabilizes. Becoming undefeatable is not reactive. It does not wait for crisis to develop strength. It anticipates volatility and prepares. It chooses small, controlled doses of discomfort to immunize against larger, uncontrollable ones. Because the goal is not to eliminate chaos, it is to ensure that when chaos arrives, you recognize it not as an alien force, but as terrain. You have already walked. Power has always understood something about human psychology. Control a population, you do not need to chain every body. You only need to influence enough minds. Throughout history, political systems have relied on fear, spectacle, and narrative. Armies enforce borders, laws regulate behavior, but perception shapes obedience. When people internalize fear, they police themselves. This is where Stoicism intersects with power. Consider a Roman emperor standing at the edge of empire. Marcus Aurelius commanded legions during brutal wars, governed amid plague, and navigated political betrayal. He possessed enormous external authority. Yet in his private writings, he reminded himself of something humbling. You control only your judgments, your actions, your character. Even as emperor, he was subject to illness, death, criticism, and uncertainty. His power over others did not exempt him from chaos. Now consider the opposite extreme. Epictetus, born into slavery, owned by a master who could punish him without consequence. His external freedom was non-existent, and yet he taught that while someone might control your body, they cannot control your will unless you surrender it to men. One with supreme political authority, one with none, both arriving at the same conclusion. Inner autonomy is separate from external status. This idea is radical. Tyranny depends on external control, movement restricted, speech monitored, resources rationed. But psychological sovereignty resists internal domination. If you cannot be forced to believe what contradicts your reason, if you cannot be humiliated without consenting to humiliation, then control meets a boundary. This does not mean external oppression is trivial. Physical suffering is real. Injustice is real. But Stoicism draws a line between what can be done to you and what can be done with your mind. You may control my body, but not my judgments. That statement is not defiance shouted in public squares. It is discipline cultivated privately, now shift to modern systems of influence. Today, chains are rarely visible. Control operates through narrative. Media manipulation shapes perception of threat and urgency. Headlines amplify fear. Outrage cycles accelerate emotional response. Algorithms prioritize content that provokes, not content that clarifies. Public shaming has become digital spectacle. Reputation can be dismantled within hours. Cancel culture, whether justified or excessive, demonstrates how quickly collective judgment can transform someone's social standing. The fear of being ostracized becomes a behavioral regulator. Economic fear operates similarly. Job insecurity, inflation, instabilities, pressures can push individuals toward compliance, silence, or conformity. When survival feels uncertain, long-term principles weaken. Notice the pattern. Each mechanism targets emotion: fear, anger, shame, anxiety. The more emotionally reactive a population is, the easier it is to steer. Trigger fear, and people demand protection. Trigger outrage, and they demand punishment. Trigger envy, and they demand redistribution or status correction. Emotional escalation narrows reasoning. If individuals lack emotional discipline, they become predictable. Stoicism interrupts this predictability. It asks you to examine your reactions before acting, to question whether your outrage is proportionate or provoked, to ask whether the fear presented to you is immediate or manufactured, to separate fact from interpretation. This does not mean disengagement from society. It means engagement without hysteria. A psychologically sovereign individual cannot be easily manipulated by headlines. They do not surrender judgment to trending opinion. They are cautious of narratives designed to provoke immediate allegiance. When public shaming occurs, they evaluate evidence rather than joining mobs reflexively. When economic fear rises, they prepare pragmatically without collapsing into panic. When ideological conflict intensifies, they resist reducing complex issues into tribal slogans. Stoicism becomes resistance psychology, not resistance through rebellion alone, but through clarity. It protects the inner domain where autonomy lives. Without that domain, external freedom becomes fragile. With it, even constrained environments contain dignity. History repeatedly shows that oppressive systems fear independent thinkers more than loud rebels. A person who governs their own mind cannot be easily recruited into mass hysteria. They cannot be baited into every outrage cycle. They cannot be pacified solely with comfort or frightened solely with threat. Psychological freedom is quiet. It does not always trend, but it accumulates. And when enough individuals cultivate it, power structures encounter a population less susceptible to emotional manipulation. The Stoics understood this centuries ago. You may influence my environment. You may restrict my options. You may attempt to intimidate, but if my judgments remain my own, your power has limits. In a world increasingly shaped by narrative warfare and emotional engineering, that boundary is not abstract philosophy, it is protection. There is one force no empire has conquered. No algorithm has outpaced it. No wealth has bribed it. Death. The Stoics kept this reality close, not as a morbid fixation, but as a compass. They called it Memento Mori. Remember that you will die in a culture that hides death behind hospital curtains and digital distractions. This practice feels uncomfortable. We prefer to scroll, to plan, to accumulate, to assume there will always be more time. But time is the only currency that cannot be replenished. Remembering death sharpens clarity. When you become aware that your existence is temporary, trivial concerns begin to dissolve. The argument you replayed in your mind for hours shrinks in importance. The minor insult that bruised your ego feels less significant. The obsession with appearing impressive to strangers loses urgency. Mortality reorganizes priorities. Fear of death operates quietly beneath many human behaviors. Greed often emerges from the illusion that accumulation creates permanence. If I gather enough wealth, enough property, enough assets, perhaps I can shield myself from vulnerability. But death does not negotiate with bank accounts. Fame obsession reflects a similar anxiety. If I can be remembered, if my name can echo beyond my lifespan, perhaps I can outmaneuver oblivion. Entire industries revolve around visibility. Being seen becomes synonymous with being significant. Anxiety, at its root, frequently ties back to mortality. We fear losing health because it reminds us of fragility. We fear losing status because it threatens survival within social hierarchies. We fear uncertainty because unpredictability hints at danger. Desperation often follows the same logic. People cling to relationships, careers, identities, not always out of love or purpose, but out of terror. Terror of being alone. Terror of insignificance. Terror of running out of time. But when mortality is consciously accepted, something paradoxical happens. Fear loses leverage. If death is inevitable, then many of the frantic attempts to secure immortality through status, wealth, or reputation appear distorted. This does not eliminate ambition, it purifies it. You begin to ask, what is worth pursuing within a finite life? The Stoics did not meditate on death to become passive. They did it to become decisive. If today were your last, would you spend it seeking validation from strangers? Would you waste it on resentment? Would you remain silent about truths that matter to you? Mortality compresses hesitation. It also deepens gratitude. When you understand that every conversation could be the last, presence intensifies. Ordinary moments, shared meals, quiet mornings, simple laughter become extraordinary precisely because they are temporary. Death awareness dismantles arrogance. It equalizes emperor and servant, billionaire and laborer. Titles dissolve in the face of biology. Power structures collapse before entropy. This realization can feel heavy, but it can also feel liberating. If you are going to die, then fear of embarrassment weakens. Fear of failure weakens. The stakes of social judgment shrink compared to the certainty of eventual disappearance. You become less willing to live cautiously for the approval of others. Memento Mori is not nihilism. It is urgency refined by perspective. It asks you to confront the ultimate boundary, so that smaller boundaries lose their intimidation. It reminds you that time is not an abstract concept. It is a diminishing resource. And in that awareness, clarity emerges. What truly matters? What deserves your attention? What is merely noise amplified by ego and fear? When you accept mortality, you stop negotiating with illusions of permanence. You stop postponing meaning. You stop attaching your identity to things that will inevitably decay. Death becomes not just an end, but an equalizer and a teacher. It whispers that you do not have forever. And in that whisper, life becomes sharper, deeper, and infinitely more intentional. We live in the most technologically advanced era. In human history, information travels across continents in seconds. Food arrives at our doors with a swipe. Medical innovation extends life expectancy beyond what ancient civilizations could imagine. Climate-controlled homes shield us from seasonal extremes. We carry devices more powerful than the computers that once sent humans to the moon. And yet, beneath this unprecedented convenience, a quieter question emerges. Are we stronger? Not physically, not technologically, psychologically. There is a growing culture of outrage, addiction. News cycles operate on emotional acceleration. Headlines are crafted not merely to inform, but to provoke. Social media platforms reward the most reactive voices. Anger spreads faster than nuance. Moral condemnation generates more engagement than reflection. Outrage becomes currency. This does not mean injustice does not exist. But when outrage becomes habitual rather than deliberate, something shifts. People begin seeking emotional spikes. The nervous system acclimates to constant stimulation. Calm feels boring. Measured dialogue feels weak. The result is impulsivity. Emotional impulsivity erodes patience. Responses are immediate, often irreversible. Nuance collapses into binary positions. Complex issues are reduced to slogans. Dialogue becomes performance. Public discourse transforms into a battlefield of identity rather than a search for truth. Parallel to this is the rise of victim. Identity, not the acknowledgement of genuine suffering, which is necessary and humane, but the elevation of suffering as primary identity. When personal pain becomes the central organizing principle of self-concept, agency weakens. If your identity is built entirely around what has happened to you, rather than what you can choose in response, then your future feels predetermined. Responsibility feels secondary. Healing feels externalized. Again, this is not mockery. Pain is real. Injustice is real. But Stoic resilience asks a different question. Given what has happened, what remains within my control? Modern fragility often manifests in comfort, dependence. Small inconveniences provoke disproportionate frustration. Delayed gratification feels intolerable. Discomfort is treated as abnormal. Silence becomes anxiety. Boredom becomes a threat. Technology has optimized convenience. It has not optimized resilience. Instant access to information has not guaranteed discernment. Constant connectivity has not guaranteed deeper relationships. Endless entertainment has not guaranteed contentment. In fact, the opposite may be true. When stimulation is constant, baseline satisfaction drops. When comfort is continuous, tolerance for stress declines. When validation is easily accessible, self-worth becomes externally tethered. Compare this to ancient resilience. The Stoics lived in unstable times, plagues, wars, political purges, slavery. Their survival required psychological discipline. They did not assume comfort as default. They assumed volatility. They trained for it. This does not mean we romanticize the past. Ancient life was brutal in many ways, but psychologically, individuals were often forced to confront hardship directly. There was less insulation between discomfort and experience. Today, insulation is abundant, but insulation can weaken structural integrity if it becomes permanent. The question becomes uncomfortable. Are we becoming more advanced or more fragile? We can map the genome, but can we endure criticism without collapse? We can build skyscrapers, but can we tolerate solitude? We can connect globally, but can we regulate our emotions locally? Progress in tools does not automatically translate into progress in temperament. This realization does not require cynicism. It requires responsibility. If modern systems amplify outrage, we must cultivate restraint. If technology accelerates comparison, we must cultivate. If convenience weakens endurance, we must reintroduce voluntary discomfort. If narratives encourage permanent victimhood, we must reclaim agency where it still exists. Strength is no longer imposed by environment. It must be chosen. The Stoics would not reject technology. They would question attachment to it. They would not deny injustice. They would emphasize response. They would not mock emotional pain. They would analyze its roots. The core issue is not whether the modern world is corrupt or decadent. It is whether individuals within it are developing the internal architecture to withstand its pressures. Because without that architecture, convenience becomes dependency. Outrage becomes habit. Identity becomes fragile. And when fragility spreads collectively, societies become easier to destabilize. Ancient strength was not mystical. It was practiced. It was built through discipline, reflection, and confrontation with reality the modern world offers. Unprecedented opportunity, but it does not automatically offer resilience. That must still be constructed into. Personally, deliberately, the tools have evolved. The question is whether we have. What does it mean to become undefeatable? It does not mean invincible. It does not mean immune to loss, insulated from betrayal, or protected from grief. It does not mean you will never fail, never be criticized, never experience pain. To be undefeatable is something quieter. It is to be internally unconquered. Across everything we have explored, a pattern emerges. Chaos is inevitable. Power structures shift. Public opinion fluctuates. Wealth rises and collapses. Bodies age. Death waits patiently. These forces are older than ideology, older than technology, older than empire. You cannot dominate them, but you can decide whether they dominate you. Control what you can. This principle sounds simple until it collides with ego. You cannot control outcomes, but you can control effort. You cannot control reputation, but you can control conduct. You cannot control the behavior of others, but you can control your response. When you internalize this, anxiety loses its foundation. You stop demanding certainty from an uncertain world. You focus on disciplined action rather than guaranteed results. Detached from ego, you are not your status, not your praise, not your criticism. When identity is no longer fused with public perception, humiliation loses its power. When pride is no longer fragile, insult becomes noise rather than wound. The ego craves validation and fears disrespect. But once you see its hunger clearly, you stop feeding it with your peace. You begin to act from principle instead of image, trained through discomfort. Comfort alone cannot prepare you for volatility. Voluntary hardship, whether physical, emotional, or intellectually, expands tolerance. When you choose difficulty, you reduce fear of it. You teach yourself that pain is not annihilation. Resilience is not built during catastrophe. It is built beforehand. Master interpretation. Events are neutral until judged. Anger arises from expectation. Fear from imagined futures. Envy from distorted comparison. When you examine your interpretations, you reclaim authority over emotion. This is not suppression. It is sovereignty. Accept mortality. Memento Mori is not a dark obsession. It is clarity. When you remember that time is finite, trivial concerns fade. Desperation softens. Urgency sharpens. You begin to ask whether your actions align with values that would matter at the end. Death equalizes power, wealth, and fame. It exposes illusion. And in doing so, it frees you from chasing permanence in impermanent things. Bring these principles together, and a transformation occurs. You stop being easily provoked, easily manipulated, easily destabilized. You become less reactive to outrage cycles, less dependent on validation, less fearful of discomfort, less terrified of uncertainty. Not because the world has become gentler, but because you have become steadier in a chaotic world. The calm mind becomes revolutionary. When narratives attempt to inflame you, you pause. When fear is amplified for control, you analyze. When status is threatened, You remain anchored in character. When comfort is removed, you endure. You may still lose positions. You may still experience heartbreak. You may still face injustice. Being undefeatable does not mean life becomes painless. It means defeat does not penetrate your core. They can take your comfort. They can take your reputation. They can take your possessions. But if they cannot take your judgment, if they cannot command your interpretation, if they cannot force you to betray your principles, then you remain undefeated.